My name is Ben Wetherell. I'm the water quality scientist for OARs.
All right, my name's John McCone. I work for the Merrimack River Watershed Council. I'm the policy and education specialist.
Hi, I'm Susie Bresney. I'm the Massachusetts Water Resources Program Manager at the Merrimack River Watershed Council.
Now, I was wondering, historically, has the water quality of the rivers changed over time?
Oh yeah, dramatically. There was a period for probably about 150 years where it was terrible. And that was because of the mills that were built all the way along it. They were dumping, it was basically an open sewer. So everything that you can imagine was going into it, dyes and chemicals from factories, people's waste, and it just all went into the river, and that was the thought at the time. That's how you got rid of waste.
You could tell the color of the dye that they were using in the mills in a given day because the river was the same color. So whatever the mills were doing, that was dumping straight into the water. So that meant dye in textile mills, also a lot of heavy metal pollution and other industrial pollution, that some of which is still in the river sediments today.
And it wasn't until around the 1970s that there was a new understanding and a new law, which was the Clean Water Act, that changed that, and that kind of dumping had to stop. And so that's when you started to see these sewage treatment plants that were built all the way along the river start to go up. And so that has cleaned up the river dramatically. There's all kinds of species that are living in it now that could never have survived 50 years ago.
What defines clean water?
Depends on who you're asking. So there's different standards for water quality set by state agencies and federal agencies, the EPA. So there's fishable, there's swimmable, there's drinkable. There's water quality standards for certain types of species. Different aquatic species have different tolerances of different types of water quality parameters. So, and those things are measured in different ways. So, a lot of times if we're asking if the water is swimmable, if it's safe to swim in, we're usually looking at bacteria concentrations in the water. And if we're asking, if the water is safe to drink, bacteria concentrations, but a lot of other things too. So that's the highest standard. The Merrimack is not drinkable directly. It gets treated and then becomes drinkable, but directly from the river it's not. But it is swimmable most of the time. And then, depending on the different types of species, they might have different criteria that they require for water quality. So certain fish might require certain temperatures. Cold water fish species can't tolerate as warm temperatures of water as other species. All fish species need a certain amount of dissolved oxygen, which is one way of measuring water quality. So, and that often goes hand in hand with temperature. And it's sort of like a chain of events where if you have one kind of deficiency in one type of water quality issue, it can impact other ones and make them either not safe for wildlife or not safe for people to swim in or not safe to fish. So it's a complicated question. I don't know if my answer made it more complicated or less, but I would say the short answer is what defines good water quality depends on the purpose that you're using that water for.
Oftentimes, the older the towns are, the more possible potential issues. Sewer systems, older sewer systems have more probability of leakage and incorrect management with relation to the rivers. So we have a lot of old towns, old mills,
right,
along these rivers, and so we definitely notice differences. One of the indicators that's the most highly connected with population is bacteria, which is an indicator of sewage pollution.
Right.
It indicates sort of the prevalence of pathogens in the water, and we generally always see higher bacterial levels around populated centers.
Right.
And much lower levels around places that are unpopulated.
Does the concentration or significance of pollution vary along the river?
Yeah, absolutely. So the water quality monitoring program that I oversee at MRWC, the Merrimack River Watershed Council, we focus primarily on bacteria. We also look at other kind of physical and chemical parameters, but for the purposes of this question, I'll focus on bacteria because that's what I know and that's what I can speak to. So depending on where the source of bacteria is coming from and a whole bunch of other factors, the concentration of bacteria absolutely varies a lot across the river. It doesn't vary just up to downstream. It varies in depth. It varies if you're close to the shore or close to the middle. This is a real challenge of measuring bacteria and measuring different aspects of water quality in general, is that the river is a moving body of water that's always changing and is not always perfectly mixed. So one sample that you collect at one point in time in one place may not be representative, in the broad brush way that sometimes we want it to be or hope that it could be. But we definitely have seen that close to the urban city centers, we don't have monitoring sites in Nashua, but we do have monitoring sites in Manchester, around Lowell, around Lawrence, the greater Lawrence area, and then around Haverhill. And then we also have monitoring sites in between and downstream. We do find that the higher bacteria concentrations typically are closer to the urban centers, and it's kind of compounded by a few things. One is that's where combined sewer overflows happen, and those are point sources of pollution that we know dump into the river at these specific locations at specific times. So if we collect a sample just downstream of that point source at the time that it's being dumped in, that's going to be influencing the concentration of bacteria that we find.
Could you go a little further into what a CSO is? So I understand there's wastewater involved, but are there other sort of pollutants in that as well?
Yeah, there's pretty much anything that would be dumped into your, or flushed down the drain. Any kind of contaminant that you can think of from a factory or from a home or even from street drains. They're all going into the river at a very fast pace right after one of these rain events. So this would be an intense rainstorm, when you might have a ½ inch of rain or something like that. The sewage plants will be able to deal with sewage that goes into them most days, but when all of a sudden it's all coming in, a lot of it is coming into the sewer system from the streets, because that's just the way these old cities were plumbed. They got all the water, all the waste into the river. And it takes a lot of money and effort to untangle that mess of pipes. So we're, let's say, 90% there. But in that 10% period when this happens, all of that goes into the sewage system. It's too much all at once for the plant to handle, and so they have to release it into the river. So this is raw sewage. It's things coming off the streets. It's everything that's in the pipes goes into the river untreated.
Is it the age of the sewer system, or perhaps the practices of people living in the area? I'd say it's fairly poorly understood. Generally, the belief is that leaking sewers, if you're in an area which is managed by sewer systems, by a sewer system and not septic tanks, generally it's leaking sewers, pipes that might be cross-connected, possibly a storm sewer pipe, an old building that might have connected to a storm sewer pipe instead of a sanitary sewer pipe. They're very hard to find. They require going up the sewer system and basically doing tests as you go up the system and doing those in the same type of precipitation event, because it changes with precipitation. Right.
But yeah, the general thinking is that these high levels of bacteria in the rivers are a result of leakages in the sewer system.
If you're in an area where there's septic tanks, then septic tank overflows or poor septic fields can then leach out into the rivers.
Right.
But there's also a lot of question whether the bacteria levels are caused by wildlife or animals. Dog owners need to be careful about what they do with their dog waste, because dog waste placed in a storm sewer will wash right into the rivers, and that will cause that will show up in the bacteria counts also.
When that happens, is there something that can be done? Do we have to wait for the river just to sort of dilute everything, or is it about sort of increasing the capacity that these treatment plants can work at?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the short term, the answer is yes, stay out of the river for if you see a significant rainstorm. Stay out for a couple, 3 days. We post on our website and on our Facebook page when these things happen. And there's also a public alert system now that's been in place for about a year. So people can check with the Lowell Health Department and find out what's happening, whether or not there's been CSOs. So that's the short-term solution. The long-term solution is to get this piping situation straightened out and to increase the capacity at the plants. And that costs a tremendous amount of money. You know, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. Also, it's if you live on a street in the city, you might have your street completely torn up for, you know, a couple of weeks. And so there's a lot of disruptive work that goes into it. It's not popular work with the public, but it has to be done.
Right. Yeah, I didn't really realize how fundamental the infrastructure would have to change for that to happen. Are there moves in that direction? And if so, what's the timeline look like for that type of thing?
Yeah, so there are moves in that direction. So technically, any city that is dumping sewage into the river is in violation of the Clean Water Act. So that was passed 50 years ago, but the federal government recognizes that you can't fix this overnight. And so cities like Lowell, where this is happening, have a period of time in which they can straighten this out. And so the EPA is watching what they're doing and helping to guide them. And sometimes there's a stick and sometimes there's a carrot involved. But for a city like Lowell, you could be looking at maybe 20 years from now when this is finally going to be fixed. And it's going to cost a lot of money, unfortunately.
How would someone more specialized measure water quality?
Sure. Yeah, so there's, it depends on what you're looking for. So what we do is we have these small little handheld meters. I should have brought one with me to show you. And it's just a small little thing about this big, and it measures temperature, total dissolved solids, salinity, and conductivity. And so it has a little, they come in different ways. Some of them you drop the meter right into the water, and then you have a little handheld computer and it reads off the readings. And then some you fill a little cup and put it onto the sensor. You fill the cup with the river water, and then that reads, and then it has a little computer that reads off the readings. So for, we call those kind of like temperature or chemical or physical parameters, and those are ones that you just measure right in the water. Then there are other handheld meters that can measure other things like nutrients, but the way that we do it for nutrients, for bacteria, or for anything kind of more advanced that we're looking at, we'll collect a sample, and each parameter that you're looking for kind of requires a different type of sample collection procedure. So for example, for bacteria, we have these sterile cups, and you have to wear gloves, and the cup is sealed, and you open it up so that no bacteria from anywhere else gets into the cup except from the river water. You fill it, cap it, and then you put it on ice, and you keep it cold until you bring it to a lab for analysis. For example, for phosphorus, you'll similarly wear gloves, but it's not a sterile container, and so you'll fill the container and kind of rinse it a few times with the river water to make sure you have, you know, all the water in there and everything in there is from the river. And then you have to treat it with acid to sort of maintain how much phosphorus is in the sample at that moment in time, because there still might be living things in the water that could change the amount of phosphorus or the type of phosphorus. So you use acid to sort of stabilize it, put it on ice, bring it to a lab. Other types of sample collections, you might have to filter it. Sometimes you might have to freeze it before you bring it to the lab. So depending on what you're looking at, there's sort of different sample collection procedures. But those are the two that we typically use for phosphorus and bacteria.
So we've been talking about bacteria mostly. That's the indicator that is really the easiest for people to understand and the most sort of widely discussed indicator, because it really is about swimming, about how you can access the river, and it's a direct indicator of sewage.
Right.
Bacteria, we sample for bacteria by taking a water sample with a bottle, and we'll take the water sample by hand from the water, or use a pole like this to just reach out and collect the sample. OARs doesn't have a lab of our own, so we send our samples to an outside lab. We send them to a lab in Air, Massachusetts.
They come in different ways. Some of them you drop the meter right into the water, and then you have a little handheld computer and it reads off the readings. And then some you fill a little cup and put it onto the sensor. You fill the cup with the river water, and then that reads, and then it has a little computer that reads off the readings. So for, we call those kind of like temperature or chemical or physical parameters, and those are ones that you just measure right in the water. Then there are other handheld meters that can measure other things like nutrients, but the way that we do it for nutrients, for bacteria, or for anything kind of more advanced that we're looking at, we'll collect a sample, and each parameter that you're looking for kind of requires a different type of sample collection procedure. So for example, for bacteria, we have these sterile cups. And you have to wear gloves, and the cup is sealed, and you open it up so that no bacteria from anywhere else gets into the cup except from the river water. You fill it, cap it, and then you put it on ice, and you keep it cold until you bring it to a lab for analysis.
Basically, for bacteria, you add some feed to the bacteria and incubate it, and then see how many colonies grow after a certain amount of time.
Understood.
So they do that. It takes about 24 hours for a bacteria analysis to come back. But that's what we do. We have a team of about 30 volunteers, and we're always looking for new volunteers. But a team of 30 volunteers who go out on a regular basis, once a week, once a month, and collect these samples from specific locations around the rivers. They take these supplies with them, and come back and bring back a collection of bottles from each site, and then we just take the bottles to the lab. The bottles have to be there within 6 hours of collection time.
What are some nuances to measuring water quality that laymen might not be aware of?
Yeah, I think a major one is kind of what I was mentioning earlier, that the river is a moving, ever-changing body of water. And so just because you collected a sample yesterday at this one place at this one point in time, you can't say that that applies to today or tomorrow. Or, because you collected samples last year, it doesn't mean it's going to be the same this year. And I think that's a big challenge, both in collecting data and kind of making sense of the data when we analyze it, but also in communicating it to people. So we can say, last time it rained this much, these are the things we observed, but things might be different than, even if it rains that exact same amount, 10 days from now, the river's different. It might have more water in it. It might have less water in it. It might have more sediment in it. It might be moving faster. It might be a different temperature. And all of those things affect water quality. So I think the biggest challenge and probably the biggest nuance of water quality is that it's always changing. So we can collect data, and the more data we have, the better we can kind of understand and correlate different things. If we collect data, you know, every time there's a 1-inch storm, and we have 25 1-inch storm sets of data, we can start to say a lot about what a 1-inch storm does to the river. But if we have one 1-inch storm, and then a 1/2-inch storm, and then a bunch of sunny days, and then, you know, it's hard to say this is definitely because of this, and that's because of that. There are so many variables. So I think that's one of the trickiest things, and one of the biggest nuances is the river's always changing. As fast as we can collect data, it changes.
Let's see. I think I want to step back just a little bit to, you also mentioned swimming in the river. Mm-hmm. So growing up in the area, I have swum in the river, but I've also heard a lot of sentiment that it's not swimmable. So yeah, it sounds like you're saying that the river, for the most part, is good to swim in?
Yeah. Most days it is. If it's been dry for the past 3 days, and by dry I mean there hasn't been a rainstorm, yeah, it's going to be fine for you to swim in. It's what's called a Class B river, so that means that it's swimmable, it's fishable, you know, you can boat on it, all those kinds of things. It's just when we have these sewage incidents that you don't want to be in it. The other thing is it has a legacy, you know, going back hundreds of years of people. You know, there was a time when you could smell the river, you know, and you would see things floating by. It was bad, you know, for a very long time, and it's hard to get rid of that reputation. So that's kind of the complex message of this, is that yes, it is a much cleaner river than it was, and there's been a lot of success. But we still have these problems that we haven't nailed down yet. And there are other problems that are emerging now that, you know, we're just starting to learn about. You've probably heard of PFAS, forever chemicals, or microplastics. You know, these are things, even pharmaceuticals, that are passing through people's bodies and going into the wastewater treatment plant and then into the water supply, and they have an impact. So these are new things that we're starting to learn about that we've got to figure out how to tackle.
That was one of the other things I was going to ask about, actually, is CSO sort of like the primary contaminant to be concerned with, or are there others that are proportionably as bad, or perhaps even higher risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's the problem that is the most understandable for the public. You know, you can visualize sewage is being dumped into a river. People get that, and they can understand, okay, that's happening. I don't want that to happen. And there is a solution, and it's what we talked about earlier, you know, tearing up the streets and enlarging the sewage plants. But there are other things that are going into the river that can be just as bad. For example, runoff from parking lots and from homes, and contaminants are coming off of people's lawns, you know, fertilizers, things like, you know, stuff that we use every day that we might think, you know, this is just part of our daily lives. But once you start to flush them all into a river, they're going to be bad for that river, and they're going to impact its health. So CSOs are a piece of the problem, you know, and they're a problem that because we're looking at kind of limited places where they happened, we can tackle them. When it comes to water that's running off parking lots, well, that happens all through the Merrimack Valley. You know, a city like Lowell, it's the whole city, really. So how do you tackle that? And that's a much harder question, but that's another contaminant source that we've got to look at.
Right, yeah, that's an issue with impermeable surfaces, right?
Right.
Would something like create more green spaces, or is there, I mean, you mentioned that it's a tricky thing to tackle, but are there sort of proposals for tackling that?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So a green space would be a good way to do it. There are areas where you can create sort of almost like a dry wetland, you know, is this kind of a park area, or even within a street, or not in a street, but in a sidewalk or something like that. You might see there's a little sunken garden or something like that, and the purpose of those is to absorb water. They might fill up with water during a storm, and then that water will gradually seep into the ground. And the ground and trees and nature are our best protection against some of these pollutants, but we need to create those spaces within cities. so that water can get absorbed and be held there instead of just running off and going straight into the river.
This is a tangential thought, but I almost wonder if they were to tear up the streets to replace infrastructure, that might be a good time to just have a few patches of water.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or something, you know?
Yeah, good thought. So you're right. You've got to be thinking of these things holistically. You know, how do we solve 2 or 3 problems at once and limit the amount of disruption that the public, and expense perhaps too, that the public wants to see.
We have all of this information available on our website, merrimack.org, and we have an interactive dashboard that people can use to look at our data, and you can zoom in on specific events and kind of zoom in on specific sites and kind of explore yourself the data. And then we'll be developing the report on the 2022 data this coming spring, probably. We'll be putting that together. So that's for all the nerds out there.